So let's discuss my 9 million DPS comment I made in a previous video. Right, in the previous video, I said that I recommend 9 million DPS to cover basically all varieties of content, just about. And I've gotten a ton of questions about this, and I need to state from the off, this is just my own personal opinion. After trying to look back at previous metas and the way in which, throughout the years, we have progressed our DPS builds, I tried to find similar themes, of which there weren't really any other than going for the maximum amount of DPS at the time. However, the one thing I did find very loosely is that before things like Strikers and Heartbreaker, and the meta was basically always high end, one thing I did find is that all of the solo style builds would tend to be around 7 million DPS, and then for legendary and raids, the builds would be upped to about 9 million DPS. So this is just a very loose connection I am making. I am not saying this is a blanket statement whatsoever. I've recently covered quite a few skill builds, and some of these skill builds were as low as like 5 to 6 million DPS. And as we all know, that when legendaries first came out, the recommended go-to way to do legendaries at the time, while we were still learning them, was to do skill builds. We could easily do legendaries solo and in group with skill builds doing below what I am suggesting to be the recommended amount. So it's not a complete blanket statement. This is a very large bracket which I'm hoping to go over, as well as mostly just explain my reasoning. Now, I did do a ton of research on this to see if I could find any information on Gear 1.0. I was there, I did play it, however, my memory is terrible. I've had a drink since then, and actually trying to find information on builds back then is few and far between because they're buried under a ton of the new meta or one-man army. Yay. However, what we can do just to get like the briefest but also the easiest explanation on this is look at the high-end recommended builds of today, and hopefully this will suffice as to why I am recommending this, as well as also show the importance of utilizing your specializations in a way in which help your team, because the recommended 3-piece Providence, Contractors, Foxes, Coyote's Mask. Sometimes you'd swap out Coyote's Mask for Grupo, depending on how many you have. This build, I'm aware I'm using Glass Cannon, we'll readjust this in a second, but this build hits an average of 7.8 million DPS. Now, some of you might be wondering, how will this look with Obliterate? Not a problem. Which then gives us 7.2. Hopefully you can see that in AMP 1, 0.3 has gone missing, and the TWD has gone from 25 to, well, 0.25 to 0.5. It's at this point where I'm hoping you'll be asking, well, hang on, you're recommending 9 million DPS for the raid, but that's also the recommended raid build. You're correct. However, the reason we recommend this in a raid, and it's also the reason we recommend only taking 2 new players through at a time, is simply because everyone else knows what they're doing. They have specific setups as well as utilities in which they are able to utilize to help bolster you as well as the rest of their team. Just for example, we're going to add in 1 healer and 1 player running Demolitionist onto the build with Obliterate. So an FI healer gives us another 25% total weapon damage, putting it our maximum to 0.75, and having someone as Demolitionist puts Detox to 0.23. As you hopefully can see, this puts us very damn near to 9 million DPS. And so far we've just covered you, the new player, a healer, and someone running demo. We still have another 5 players worth of buffs to put into this, but we're already at 9 million. Essentially, we're 150k short, but we're basically at 9 million DPS. This is the pattern. It's not really a pattern, it's just a thing that I have found that I have adopted as like a benchmark when recommending and creating builds, especially either for solo, within and up to heroic, I would argue 7 million, and anything above that, group play or going into raids, legendaries, etc., will be 9 million. That being said, however, I'm hoping you have just seen that effectively the build hasn't changed. What has essentially changed is if you are going from solo into group, what are those other players doing? Now, there are a variety of things you can do here. Having someone run Sharpshooter for an extra headshot damage, having someone run Firewall for another 10% amp, having someone run Survivalist for another 10% amp against status affected targets. Which again, if we apply to our high-end Obliterate build, total weapon damage back to 0.5. Our headshot damage has gone up to 1. We were at 90. It's gone up to 1 because someone's running Sharpshooter. And in AMP 1 and in AMP 2, we have a 0.1 each. 1 for Firewall, 1 for Survivalist. So already at this point, we've taken our build from 7.2 mil to, again, basically just about broaching the 9 mil mark. It's at this point where I want to go on a quick tangent because I've seen a lot lately from a select community, basically saying team synergy beats DPS 100% of the time. This is kind of correct. I'm kind of showing that now, but what they don't get is 99.9% of your team synergy comes from just equipping intelligent choices with your specialization. That is literally it. Like, there's your team synergy, just equipping a specialization that is actually going to benefit your team. That is it. Having 4 people run Gunner basically means nothing. You can have all the build synergy in the world. It's not going to compete with just having one person swap the Demolitionist to give the rest of your team 5% detox. Obviously, that is high end. We are able now to do so much more with things like Heartbreaker, Strikers, even Umbra actually can compete in this area, though ideally we don't recommend Umbra because it adds a good few too many mechanics into our overall playstyle. In cover, out of cover, in cover, out of cover, in cover, out of cover. And it just doesn't work out as well as you would hope in a cover-to-cover looter shooter, despite the in-cover, out-cover. This also then does expand as to why, when we talk about solo legendaries and alike build scenarios of where you would take a certain build, this is why we do recommend things like Strikers, because in terms of overall performance, they are going to be your best option. So if we now actually look at Strikers versus high end, however, we've got no stacks on Strikers, which is why it's doing basically 25% less. So this is basically both of their starting points. However, saying this, we are also factoring Obliterate on the high end. If you remove Obliterate, you are essentially, they're like 10% different. Not much in it. To get these two builds to draw basically even, we need 34 stacks of Strikers. 34, that's it. And we're using a St. Elmo's here, which basically means we have 978 RPM. 978 divided by 60 is like 16. Essentially, after 2 seconds of firing, we have drawn even with the high-end build. If we put all 100 stacks in, we're doing like 50% more, and we're quite a bit over that 9 million DPS benchmark. So, hopefully this explains my very weird, loose reasoning as to why for solo up to heroic I recommend 7 million DPS, and for anything above solo heroic, as in group heroic or even legendaries, raids, incursions, I recommend 9 million DPS and up. I would say 7 million and 9 million are like the minimum. Obviously, things like Strikers can go far beyond this. And it's also why Strikers is so powerful in this regard, because it's able to do essentially team damage solo. Have fun, good luck, don't die. It's bad for the health.